Hello, this is Donovan, and I'm going to continue now with chapter 3. We're going to begin chapter 3 of Sex and Sacrament, my life's work. This chapter is a deepening of the mental prayer that we looked at in the last few episodes in chapter 2. Deepening mental prayer, recollection as remembering and becoming your whole self. Some of the kinds of prayer we're going to look at here as we look at inventories be anti-racism. I'll offer a guided practice in a prayer of anti-racism for those of us that are confessing the impact that racism may have had on us, doing an inventory of that. Prayers of confession in a more general sense, and gratitude lists, which are also a part of making an inventory, right? So those are some of the practices we'll look at, and now I'm going to get into the actual text. Introduction to deeper self-reflection in prayers of recollection. So far, we've looked at ordinary prayer, and there are so many different ways of praying with our minds and voices in this ordinary way that we could explore them for a lifetime. There's no need to, as some of the guides we've looked at so far often taught, you don't have to look at any other prayer practices if you really like mental and vocal prayer with guided words and texts. You can explore those forever. Reciting memorized words of prayer like the Lord's Prayer, like we did last night, the Serenity Prayer. I posted a video that guides through some of those types of prayer. Other prayers that people you love and trust might have taught you, praying on your own or with others, singing or chanting mindful words of devotion on your own or with other people, like Kumbaya or the Heart Sutra, chants. I've posted videos of those as well, sharing time with a couple people I love, singing Kumbaya and chanting the Heart Sutra. Any words or thoughts that we try out to open our minds and hearts to God with our own thoughts, words, and voices, or words from a sacred text or from a friend, whatever it might be. Any of those words or thoughts we use to open up a loving connection with God in prayer. Those are all different forms of ordinary prayer. So taking this practice a little deeper, if we'd like to go a little deeper than that ordinary level of mental prayer, we can try a more contemplative form of mental prayer that's called the prayer of recollection. And there's a lot of different words for it. In the Christian tradition, if we're going back to ancient medieval and late Middle Ages, really, that's a phrase that's used for it. It's really not commonly used anymore. I kind of like prayer of recollection because it doesn't have the baggage of confession. Confession is a prayer of recollection, but confession has a lot of baggage. So this prayer of recollection, let's call it that way, and I think of like collecting the recycling, collecting collectibles that you enjoy. They give you, have whatever you collect, all right? And it may not be material things. In this case, it's definitely not. It can be memories. It can be, anyway, we'll go into that later. Anyway, so recollection. It might seem a little bit more challenging or complex, this form of prayer. It might seem a little bit more complex than when we're just using words that we've memorized or that we're reading. And especially when it's unfamiliar, it may seem a little hard to do, but its goal is actually to help us make less active effort when we're praying. As we become more passive in this prayer of recollection, the goal as we go through each kind of prayer that we're going to continue onward in the next few weeks, as we become more passive, we let God do the talking, let God do the work, rather than us monopolizing the conversation with our own words. So our goal in this kind of prayer is first to find our connection with God by just looking actively within ourselves. So we just kind of look within and notice that God's already there. So that's how it starts. And then we just let ourselves experience God's peace more passively, giving our whole inner selves to God's. Once we notice that we're already connected, we just kind of surrender and bask in it. And we begin to more fully sense that we're not earning or winning the gift of God's presence. We're just receiving it. So that's the journey that this kind of prayer takes. It helps us transition from a more active use of our mind to, oh, I'm looking inside and I'm kind of noticing what God's doing in here, to letting go, right? And just noticing that God's already there. The 16th century Spanish mystic and doctor of the church, who teaches more about prayer than any other teacher, Teresa of Avila, I've been sharing a lot about her, described this kind of prayer as an especially difficult struggle, even for her, but very rewarding whenever she was actually able to experience it. In her words, the soul collects together all the faculties, all the senses, the faculties of the mind, and enters within itself to be with its God, shutting itself up. I'm going to change that wording there. Shutting itself up within this little heaven of the soul, wherein dwells the maker of heaven and earth. So she and many other people that practice contemplative prayers sometimes talked about going inside yourself as if you were going into a private room or a private little hideaway or getaway, alone with God, almost like a honeymoon suite with God. That's how prayer is, that intimate and sweet and private. And all kinds of noise might be going on around you, like it was for me last night when I was guiding Lord's Prayer and Lectio Divina. Whatever's going on out there, what's going on in here is that sweet, intimate, private time with God, just noticing that God's there. So prayer of recollection, and again, this is why I like this phrase. If we think of recollection as remembering, putting the pieces back together, getting a bigger picture, kind of think of it like puzzle pieces. I was just doing a puzzle with my children a few weeks ago. So yeah, just I think of it as a puzzle with really little tiny annoying pieces that are hard to put together, but as you're putting it back together, you're getting this bigger picture. So that's, to me, that's what this kind of prayer does. It takes a jumble of stuff and turns it into something that starts to make sense and look beautiful. So this prayer of recollection is a way to help us let go of relying on our own strength so that instead we can cling to God. Teresa says, the prayer opens one's soul and prepares one to meet God in truth and to be open to recognizing ways in which our own sense of self has become our personal idol. Not to shame us, but to help us step away from or out of self and back into the presence of God's love, for which we were all created. So, for example, we could start this prayer of recollection with a little inventory of our own limitations of body and spirit, admitting these limitations to ourselves and to God, so that we can then fully affirm the reality of our true identity as created for union with God. So yes, we do look at things that, oh, these are some rough edges that I have, these are some limitations that I have, these are some places where I need God's help. But we're not doing that to shame or bully ourselves or beat ourselves up or make ourselves feel small. It's to right size ourselves, to not too big or too small, but to just to say, okay, this is who I am, and God loves me, and God's here with me. When we're looking at things realistically, both the places we need God's help and the things that God's done in us and given us that are wonderful gifts, those are all ways that we can see God's work in us. And God's helping me grow in this way. God's given me a gift in this way. And wow, I really say I need God's help in this area. They're all ways that can connect us to God, even though they're different. So this is definitely not about bullying ourselves. In this kind of prayer, we examine our current relationship with God and resolve to pay attention to God and let God in, usually in silence. In this let go and let God way of praying, the more we let go of our own individual efforts, our words, our thoughts, the less effort it actually takes to pray, just resting in God. So during the next guided prayer practice, at the top point when we finally get to the end of this chapter, we'll apply this by trying. The first thing I'll guide you through is called the prayer of Sacrament. It comes from the Jesuit tradition and also from Spain, roughly around the time that that Teresa was writing comes from the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola. But before we go into self-examination, we need to let go of any ideas or old prayer habits that might get us stuck in an all too familiar groove of hearing and speaking only our perceived shortcomings. Taking an inventory of ourselves means seeing and thanking God for the good in us that God created too. So first, we'll try to learn from the balanced and whole self ancient prayer practice of Christian confession, spiritual autobiography as a heartfelt prayer of praise to our Creator. So tomorrow, this was a very short introduction to where we're going because I don't want to talk about confession and have us think that this is like, oh great, now we get to tear ourselves down. Tomorrow, what we're going to do is look at a section that's called Mental Prayer as a Dialogue with the One Who Loves Us. Thank you, and I'm sorry, as recollection prayers. So that's a heads up for tomorrow. Thanks for joining me to start chapter 3 in the prayer of recollection.